You know, when we talk about the objectification of women, our minds usually jump straight to physical appearance. But what if the real story is way more complicated than that? What actually drives our tendency to see a person as, well, less than a whole person? Let's dive in and explore the really surprising science behind our snap judgments.
And make no mistake, this is not some abstract academic concept. Research shows just how common this is in our daily lives. I mean, get this. In a single week, the average woman in one study reported being the target of objectification multiple times and seeing it happen to other women almost a dozen times. It's happening constantly all around us.
So, here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to define what we're actually talking about. Then, we'll see how scientists can even measure something like this. From there, we'll put 3 key perceptions on trial, reveal the surprising verdict, and finally, we'll unpack why any of this really matters.
Right, so before we can dig into the why, we have to get crystal clear on the what. What does objectification actually mean? You know, in a scientific sense.
The clinical definition is pretty straightforward. It's when we look at someone not as a complete human being, but as a tool, an instrument to be used for our own goals. It's this fundamental shift in perception from who they are to what they are for.
And this is absolutely not harmless. The research is so clear on this. When someone is objectified, they're seen as having less of a mind, a lower moral status, and less competence. The bottom line is that this has incredibly dangerous, real-world consequences, leading to everything from increased aggression to a really disturbing lack of empathy for victims of assault.
So this brings up a fascinating question. How on earth do you scientifically measure something as subtle as seeing another person as less than human? It seems impossible, right? Well, it turns out researchers have found a pretty clever way to quantify it.
They start by breaking down what makes us human into 2 key parts. The first one is called agency. Okay, think of agency as the driver of a car. It's your ability to think, to plan, to have intentions, and to control your actions. It's the part of us that acts. And the second part, the flip side of agency, is patiency. So if agency is the driver, patiency is the passenger. It's your capacity to feel and experience things, like joy, fear, or pain. It's the part of us that senses and is affected by what happens around us. And here is the core idea. Objectification happens when we deny someone both of these qualities. We stop seeing the driver and the passenger, and all we see is the car, just an object. Okay, so now we know how to measure objectification. This lets us get to the central mystery. Researchers basically put 3 key perceptions, 3 suspects, if you will, on trial to figure out which one was the main trigger for denying women that sense of agency and patiency. Here is our lineup of suspects. First up, perceived sexual intent. In other words, how open to casual sex does a woman seem to be? Suspect number 2, perceived attractiveness. Pretty self-explanatory. And number 3, perceived age. The goal was to figure out which one of these judgments had the biggest impact on objectification.
And now we get to the climax of our whole investigation. After showing hundreds of people images of different women and asking them to rate these perceptions, the data delivered a verdict that was honestly pretty surprising. But before I show you, just take a second. Which of those 3, sexual intent, attractiveness, or age, which one do you think was the biggest driver of objectification?
And here is the answer. It wasn't how attractive she was. It wasn't her age. By a long shot, the strongest predictor of objectification was the perception that a woman was open to casual sex. That single factor was most strongly linked to seeing her as less human.
So, just how strong was that link? Well, the data showed a really powerful negative correlation. Essentially, the more a woman was perceived as being open to casual sex, the less she was seen as having self-restraint, which is a key part of her agency.
And it wasn't just agency, it was both. When perceived sexual intent went up, the ratings for both agency and patiency just plummeted. She was seen as less of a driver in her own life, and at the same time, less of a passenger who is capable of feeling things.
Okay, but here's where things get really counterintuitive. I think most of us assume that being seen as more attractive is the primary cause of objectification. But this study found something completely different.
I mean, just look at this comparison. While perceived sexual intent was negatively linked to seeing someone as a whole person, perceived attractiveness was actually positively linked. That's right, on average, more attractive women were seen as having more agency and patiency, not less.
So what about our third suspect, age? Well, it turns out it wasn't much of a factor at all. The data showed that a woman's perceived age had very little consistent effect one way or the other, basically clearing it of being a primary driver in this investigation.
So what do we do with all this? What's the big takeaway here? Let's zoom back out for a second and try to understand why these subtle perceptions have such a massive impact.
All right, here are the key takeaways. First, objectification is driven way more by stereotypes about sexual behavior than it is by beauty. Second, being seen as attractive can sometimes have a protective effect, likely because of a beautiful is good mental shortcut we all have. And third, and this is super important, this isn't just about how men see women. The study found that both men and women make these judgments in very similar ways.
And this finding really shines a spotlight on an incredibly difficult social tightrope women have to walk. The very same appearance that might lead one person to see you as attractive and grant you more humanity could lead another person to see you as sexualized, which triggers the exact opposite effect.
Which leaves us with a final, really challenging question. This research suggests our brains jump to these conclusions almost instantly based on deep-seated stereotypes. So knowing that, if our brains are wired to do this based on a single glance, how can we learn to consciously take a second, more human look?